Good afternoon. This is a picture of Mount Washington, from the road up Mount Washington, New Hampshire, which I left out of the last video. It was I think that's actually the summit. And then a couple other things. That's the location of the Ninth Street Center in the East Village. There's another picture of the location from 2016. And that's a picture of the Brown Hall, the dorm I was in at William and Mary that has since been remodeled. That was as of early 2025, and it's been remodeled into something else. But let me get on to what I want to talk about, which is my own take on the major points in favor of the gender identity movement, um, as to how it relates to things I've written about before, rather than just simply the usual explanations that are, and some of these are very good, and I'll mention them um, in the past, but I want to particularly just summarize the relevance to my own writing. And they're basically four different areas. And the first one had to do with the fact that in my first book, uh, the first of the Do Ask, Do Tell books from 1997, um, the main idea was in the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy for gays in the military. There was a big concern about privacy in the barracks. And the fact that someone with a same-sex interest could be disruptive in a same-sex military environment. And I said that was parallel to what happened to me in the dorm in 1961 at William and Mary, where I just showed you that picture of the dorm, and I built the whole argument over the privacy argument. What happened is that over time, from when Bill Clinton proposed Don't Ask, Don't Tell in 1993, in 17 years, we gradually got used to the idea, and under Obama, it was finally repealed at the end of 2010 and into 2011. And it hasn't really been actually changed by Hegseth. Not actually. It's gotten very little attention. Trans has, but not the original gay ban. But that was a very important idea. But the important point here is that now you can reasonably say that if sexual attraction in a private space is not as big an issue as it had been in the past when you were growing up, maybe you could say that about other spaces. You could say that, for example, trans women should be allowed into women's spaces, or even in bathrooms or in sports or something. You could make a similar kind of argument because you've made the argument for the military. So there's even though I think the problems are more conspicuous with, as have been pointed out, the problems seem much more conspicuous and extreme. But there are different variations on some people want the underlying insistence is that the public believe that a trans woman is actually a woman, in an essential sense, and the word woman actually means that. But that's actually to back up every other belief, so that the other beliefs don't fall apart. Because you could also claim that you're non-binary, and that's actually a gender. And again, whether a non-binary person should be in a secluded space, that would logically maybe come up as a question. And the idea that a person, even a minor, should be able to keep their sex assigned at birth a secret, from government IDs, was actually proposed by Yogyakarta in 2017, and was actually endorsed by the AMA at one point in 2021. So it sounds like a very radical proposal. It sounds like you're trying to replace biological sex with gender identity, although, the Bostock opinion in 2020 kind of conflated all three, biological sex and sexual orientation and gender identity, and kind of is not really completely resolved yet. Um, but it does sound like there's a parallelism between what I tried to argue in the first of my books, and you could logically use that as maybe trying to argue for a more open policy with regard to trans people in closed spaces. You could conceivably make the same kind of argument. So I may have helped set the set the climate, by arguing things the way I did without intending to. The details as to what happened, I'm not going to spend much on that here, but Mia Hughes and Dad Saves America has a big video on YouTube. I'll give you the link for it in the description, where a lot of it started back, with Stoller, and originally the desire to justify paraphilia or autogynephilia as a civil right was a motivating factor towards in the 1990s for trying to make um, gender identity be viewed as an essential component of somebody's character or somebody's essence, rather than just simply, even though it's done by self ID, to try to make it something that's actually sounds fixed. That was a motivating factor. But there may have been other factors that also contributed in academia to wanting to teach it in schools, like anti-bullying, for example, and a generally more socialistic view of how society should work and so forth that had developed in academia. Perhaps the indirect influence of the Frankfurt School and so forth. But I'll give you that link in the description, and it's quite long. It's a very interesting video. But it actually had built up, there had been a group in Houston in the 1990s, and that carried all the way through with WPATH into the 2010s. And then in the middle 2010s, it kind of really took off, particularly in the late 2010s. But that brings me to the second point, which is that I had covered in the first book, I had also covered the idea of psychological polarity. And when I talked about, in chapter 3, I talked about the 9th Street Center in New York. I just showed you where it was in the village. I was living in New York and from 1974 to 1978. And of course, this book by Paul Rosenfeld, I've shown you this many times, Homosexuality, the Psychology of the Creative Process, which was Paul and his partner Dean, and in the 70s had run the 9th Street Center, and I attended it for about a year or for quite a while I moved into New York. And the idea of psychological polarity, masculine and feminine personalities, and then feminine and then objective and subjective modes gave you 4 combinations. And those are sort of like, you could say they're like polarities, or they're like performativities, as far as, which Judith Butler would talk about in the 1990s. The objective and subjective part would be more like the dynamic part of your personality, the inclination, the performativity. But it was still supposed to be something that was not out in public, because then, in the 1970s, you had a private life and you had a work life. If you lived in New York City, you kind of had a lot of people you had contact with and personal. So there was some in your neighborhood, you could be kind of somewhat public. You had a work life and you had a private life, and you had your things and your possessions, your hobbies and things, and had that kind of a life. In that kind of a world, you did not need to have your polarity become a public identity. But in the world now, the way the world's working now, you could see how young people brought up in a totally different paradigm could, particularly if if they've been taught gender identity in school, could want to use it as a public label. And we'll get into more why, but it takes the pressure off of them to conform to gender stereotypes. Although you could simply take the pressure off by taking the pressure off and teaching people to behave in a more nuanced way. But that's something else. Um, then I would say that the third um, thing, I wanted to bring up was that we also, we started teaching about gender identity in schools in the middle, well, by maybe 2016, it started to become common in some schools. And one other reason might be that kids were able to find out about it on the internet because people like me had been posting all their stuff, even the text of their books, for free since 1998, and even for a long time, it was just search engines that they could find, and they could learn about these things even before we had social media, modern social media starting around 2010, and then smartphones in 2011 and 2012. But even before then, kids could learn these things. So there was, even from someone like me, there might have been some kind of pressure to introduce these in schools earlier than there would have been in the past, which would have been high school in the past. We took civics and government and studied the Constitution, the Supreme Court, and everything. And then the last thing is the fourth thing. It's just the personal attitude, A person's behavior, the pattern of someone how behaves, can imply that they have certain attitudes, and that's true of me as anyone else. And I'm kind of a lone wolf, as I say in my book, and I also wanted to. That reminds me, I wanted to point out. I talk about polarity in the second book, the 2002 book, with chapter 7, with narcissism, affiliation, and polarity. And then even in the third book, in chapter 2, the virtue of maleness. That's an interesting title, the virtue of maleness. And I talk about the anthropology of it and so forth, but I cover it in my earlier books. But I had a habit of course, I was behind physically and when I was growing up, possibly because of the measles in second grade. But I was behind physically, and I started catching up in puberty, but never completely. And it made more sense to me to be interested in the attributes of men than the attributes of women, because I just couldn't perform well enough as a boy to ever have a girl. And I'll go over that some other time, but that was kind of how I felt, and I developed homosexual feelings, but I never developed a desire to have a girl. I never really did. And it's partly because of my physical development might have been delayed by measles, might have been part of the reason. I might have an unusual reason. I was actually an only child, not a later born son. So my background may not be typical of everyone, but I would tend to want to be around the most masculine men, who were also smart. And the other thing you notice is that if you're with gay men, when you have a high IQ, you can have feminine aspects in your behavior as well as masculine aspects, and you can mix them together with your intelligence, and you can come across as being very assertive, but have your own spin on how to behave in an assertive way and be socially effective without necessarily having to have a label or change your pronouns or anything else like this. And so with higher IQ people, it didn't seem to me to be much of an issue. the whole pronoun thing, so forth. But it also sounds like if the only people you really care about are other people who are successful, then the world can never work that way. And as far as combinatorially or or cooperatively or on a global scale, the world can't work if everybody behaves that way. So you have to have people who are somewhat compromised, like me, willing to lift up people who are more compromised than they are. And I remember in 1980, when I was 37, I had one of my best years. I really traveled a lot that year. Went to Alaska and Hawaii and went to Lama Foundation. When I was living in Dallas, but the last 3 months of 1980, I did take in someone who had advertised he was homeless at MCC, and it went okay. He stayed 3 months, but he wasn't very self-reflective. He was very naive, and he didn't really have the ability to think through things, and didn't have very much. He had a very superficial way of reacting to things, and he really wasn't interesting to me the way somebody smarter, I just say that, but would have been. But that's just the way it was, and that's kind of to take someone in and then try to care for them or something. That's something that we're supposed to do, and yet that if you do that in your own family, if that's your own kids, then because they're own kids, you will take care of them, even if some of them are not as talented, as gifted as others are. They're still your kids. But if it's not yours, then it takes a real effort of reaching out when you don't have the same incentive that somebody with whose father their own family would have. And so that was the other big thing, was that sort of my own attitude about it. Uh, uh, so when when I first heard about, the gender identity, I started hearing about it a little bit 2017, 2018, after Trump was in office. And then first, the whole pronoun thing, I didn't think very much of it. I didn't, because I was retired. I didn't have to deal with it anywhere. But I did begin to think, I mean, now even people that are normie, normal gays or normal people, normative people, are expected to do something positive to reach out. They're not just supposed to leave somebody alone. I mean, homosexuals and gay people in the past wanted to be left alone to live their own lives. But now this was a change and acted the demands of activists. You were expected to reach out someone and bring them in by showing you could use your own pronouns yourself, and that gender identity could apply to you, which is, I still think, an artificial concept that is based on self-definition and not really provable. Unlike other things, it's not something that can verify externally. And yet Yogi Carter and so forth doesn't care about it, wants to get around that. So again, having everybody identified and using pronouns, even publicly, according to their gender identity, keeps them from having to be concerned about whether they can compete well with people who are more competitive according to their own biological birth sets than they are. And I think it makes society seem less competitive. And then insisting on that everybody actually accept gender identity as real in everyone, when I don't really think it is a way of getting people to do that. And, to make it the world sort of fairer for everybody in a collective sense. And maybe in a world that is more going to accept communal living in the future, more in communal economics and so forth. It does sound to look towards Marxism or communism, but I think it does. But that was I just wanted to give you my take, and how it affects my work. The relationship to the privacy arguments in the barracks, the military ban in the past, and then the fact that the use of the internet issue, and then the fact that particularly the polarity. Just hold up that book again that you've written. Still out. I think you can still get it on Amazon. The polarity issue that Paul Rosenfels brought up in the early 1970s, 20 years before Judith Butler had her performativities. And nobody else seems to talk about that as part of the history of how this whole thing happens. So I've tried to get that message out. And so I do thank you for listening today.